Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. This is the next video in my Impossible Magic preview series, the first of which you can see linked above, where I talked about the Magus. And this is probably the video other than the Magus one that I'm most excited for. Today, I am going to do a deep dive into spells, specifically the new combat-relevant spells added in Impossible Magic. I did go through the utility spells, the out-of-combat utility spells, but I did not incorporate them into this video because this video is already so dense and long. And I promise you, I read through every single spell. And this isn't me just trying to tell you in a vacuum if the spells are good or bad. Mostly, I tried to narrow down spells by the role they would most likely fulfill, and then how good they are within that role or how interesting they are within that role. So either something is fundamentally very powerful within the role I allotted it, or it's presenting a new alternative or opportunity that wasn't present before Impossible Magic came out. And I'm covering what? 50 or something spells today, so we're in for a long one, folks. Let's get into it. To get started, let's talk about some broad, sweeping changes and broad, sweeping areas where things stayed the same, mostly just universal stuff. If you're bored by this, please feel free to skip right away to the next section. The next section onwards is where I start talking about specific spells. First, every single spell from Secrets of Magic that remained Legacy is now officially remastered content. I did go through as carefully as I could, and as far as I'm aware, there are no spells that haven't made it at this point. There might be a handful of exceptions, maybe stuff that references alignment in a very specific way or some very D&D specific monsters, but as far as I can tell, pretty much everything has been reprinted. And there are a few buffs to the reprints. Not that many, only a couple, and I will highlight them later on in this video. You can see that in the timestamped chapters. Then, there's one broad sweeping change to a mechanic that was introduced in Secrets of Magic. 2-round spells. Spells where you spend 3 actions on the first turn, and previously you would then spend 3 actions casting them on the second turn for a heightened effect. This was spells like Horizon Thundersphere or Inner Radiance Torrent. Now, it's only 2 actions on that second turn, and those 2 actions don't have to be the first 2 actions they take. You're allowed to take your third action before those 2, provided that that one action does not cast a spell. And this is a very relevant buff to one specific spell, which you will see again in that buffed spells section of the video. Next up, every single battle form that got reprinted seems to have lost its flat damage bonus. I am pretty confident this is a typo. There's no way this is an intentional nerf, because the heightened versions of these spells have retained their flat damage bonus and have not had it modified whatsoever. So for some of the higher rank, some of the natively higher rank battle form spells, you have this paradoxical thing where the unheightened version is doing like 2d8 and then it goes straight to like 2d8 plus 16 with nothing in between. So it's definitely a typo, but it might look like a functional change if you see these rules updated elsewhere. So I just wanted to give a warning for that, and hopefully Paizo erratas it. Then there has been a broad change where a whole bunch of necrotic-themed spells got added to Occult. Spells that were previously not Occult now are. This includes spells like Feral Shades, Necromancer's Generosity, and the Necrotize spell. And there's one new Occult spell that's undead themed that I will highlight in the Incarnate section of this video. And speaking of Incarnates, all Incarnate spells now say Incarnate X. Tempest of Shades, for example, now says Incarnate Tempest of Shades. And Summon X, like say Summon Archmage or Summon Deific Herald, now says Incarnate X. Incarnate Archmage, Incarnate Deific Herald, etc. This is seemingly a rename for clarity, so that people don't think that these Summon X spells function the same way as the other summons, the one where you spend 3 actions on turn 1 to summon something out of an actual GM monster stat block and then sustain it per turn for actions. By naming them incarnate spells, you're making them stand out from the rest of the field. This does also implicitly disallow a certain interaction that maybe your GM might have allowed. There are feats that specifically reference summon spells, like Ostentatious Arrival for the summoner or Explosive Arrival for the wizard. Previously, one could make the argument that any spell with the word summon in its name should count, even if it lacks the summoned trait. But now that argument is gone. These spells no longer have summon in their name. And again, you will see 2 incarnate spells highlighted later on in the video. That's all for the boring universal stuff. Now let's get into specifics. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is attack trait spells. And attack trait spells are relevant to more than just the Magus, despite what a lot of community discourse might suggest. They help round out blasters' turns, and blasters can use them as high-risk, high-reward options. There are a lot of new attack trait spells in this book, something like 15, 20 or so. I'm only highlighting 5 of them. The book has a lot of the standard things you would expect of attack spells. There's attack, do a little bit of damage, get a little bit of a rider, but the 5 that stood out to me have either a unique level of power or a uniquely fun effect. The first one is Murder of Crows, a 2nd rank occult and primal spell with a 60-foot range, which is pretty decent, and it deals 6d4 piercing damage, heightened plus 3d4 every rank, dazzling enemies on a hit, and double damage and blinded on a critical hit. This is an excellent spell. This is most comparable to Briny Bolt, which is a common spell that already exists, but it's from an adventure path, so not all GMs are going to allow it. Briny Bolt blinds on a regular hit, but it does less damage than Murder of Crows, and the damage doesn't double on a critical hit, it only incrementally goes up by 2d6, and the enemy can use 1 action to turn off the blinded condition that they received. So all in all, this spell might legitimately be ever so slightly better than Briny Bolt, and I think that's saying something because Briny Bolt has always been a fantastic spell, especially for arcane casters who could sure strike with it, and Murder of Crows can be sure striked by occult casters. Primal casters might use it a little less, but it's still a good spell for them to consider, especially if you're in a party that boosts your attack rolls enough. This next one, Draw Blood, is another 2nd rank occult and primal spell, this time in melee, and that is what stood out to me. There is a pattern of spells throughout the book that are encouraging spellcasters to make their way into melee. This is something I have alluded to in past videos, and I am working on a video about this for the future, but spellcasters don't really get encouraged to get into melee all that much. There are still good reasons to do it on some builds, in some circumstances, but it's generally a better idea to stay further back, even if you're capable of operating in melee. But all of these high reward spells that operate in melee are giving you more and more justification to be there. And now that you're going to be there anyways, spells like Draw Blood become good, because it is a melee spell attack that does considerably less upfront damage than something comparable like, say, Murder of Crows, but it has some persistent bleed damage attached, and it heals you while the enemy's taken that persistent bleed damage. That increases your self-sustain if you're going to be in melee anyways, and I think that makes this spell at least interesting. I don't know if this is ultimately going to end up being a good spell that becomes a staple on anyone's list, but I think that's okay. Attack roll spells don't tend to be the staple of anyone except Maguses. They're always just tools in your toolkit, and this is a valuable tool in your kit. And then the next up, Disintegrating Puddle. This one might actually be worthy of becoming an actual staple. This is something worth building around. As far as I can tell, this is thematically making up for losing Acid Arrow, because Acid Arrow got moved into Acid Grip, which just fills an entirely different niche. And Acid Arrow was a fantastic attack roll spell for spellcasters, so losing that if you're switching fully to the remaster rules was a little bad. This spell does pretty damn good damage on a success, 2d12. That's 1d12 behind what a Shocking Grasp would do at this rank, but from a range of 30 feet. And when you hit the target, It creates a puddle in that target space and on all spaces adjacent to it, and anyone starting their turn in the area or entering it takes 1d4 acid damage, automatically, no save attached. Now, this is a little awkward and has some tension if you have melee party members who lack reach weapons, so definitely coordinate with them. Get them robes or charms for energy resistance to ensure that they can handle the acid damage if they were directly adjacent to a target you use this on. But otherwise, go ham with the spell. The spell is great. The enemy is either going to take a nice chunk of upfront damage and continue taking some persisting damage, or they would have to spend an action getting out of there, both of which are good outcomes for you. Really, the only flaw of this spell is that it heightens every 2 ranks. It heightens well every 2 ranks. It is 2d12 every 2 ranks, so it heightens as fast as Shocking Grasp on average. It just has these off levels where it feels significantly more behind. Note here that this is an arcane spell, so it is spell strikeable, and I think Maguses should definitely consider this spell as one of their go-to spell strike options. For primal casters, melee druids, for example, who like closing into the melee and controlling the battlefield there, might enjoy using this spell. And even if you're not closing in the melee yourself, coordinating with your party members, letting them grapple, trip, or shove foes to double dip on the damage will make the spell feel really good. Then there is Glacial Skewer, and this one feels tailor-made for spellcasters, not for spell striking with. This is a ranged spell attack, and the damage is not that high, because standard damage scaling for attack spell with the rider is 2d6 per rank, but the big draw of this spell is that on a hit, the enemy is pushed 10 feet away, and on a critical hit, they're pushed 20 feet away, and notably, if they got pushed into an obstacle or structure that is at least large in size, they become immobilized and skewered to that structure until they escape. This is a fantastic way to apply some control at a range, while also getting a substantial amount of damage in. It is, of course, environment dependent, but honestly, pushing enemies is also an inherently good form of control. Skewering enemies into a wall after that actually just makes it really good. And finally, Propelling Airstream. Now, so far I've shown you the spells in order of rank, but I want to show you this spell last, because of how unique it is. It is a standard spell attack that does 2d6 damage per rank and has a rider. But look at that rider. It's a 15-foot fly speed until the end of your next turn, so once you use it, you could start setting up for flying away, and that continues through your next turn. This is pretty unique. I have not seen a spell that gives you a fly speed this reliably at rank 1. I may be wrong, someone feel free to correct me, but as far as I can tell, this is a unique effect. This is really cool. A 15-foot fly speed is not a lot. You can't even really exploit it, and it is going to be outmatched by your own natural land speed, so it's not like it's helping you reposition too far. But the fact that it's flight and the fact that it's available so low rank makes it interesting enough to me to highlight. Again, not an exhaustive list. There are many more attack roll spells in this book. A lot of them just do the standard thing you would expect. Standardly scaling damage, some kind of a useful rider on top. They're all valid considerations. These are just the highlights. Next up, I wanted to talk about blasting spells, because anyone who's stayed on this channel long enough will know that I love blaster casters, and I love blaster casters who, as they rank up, get cool zoning and debuffing riders attached to their blasts. And we will get into a lot of those in the later sections of this video as well. But for now, mainly the pure blasts, or the blasts whose riders are a secondary thing. First up, there is Iron Rain. Iron Rain is a new arcane or primal 3rd rank spell that is effectively a Cave Fangs that does a little bit less upfront damage and deals persistent bleed damage as well. It's a pretty clear-cut side grade to Cave Fangs, though I will note that it has the minor downside of not being dismissible, so it does need more coordination with your party members to make sure you're not getting in their way. But other than that, this is a fantastic and cool spell. And notably, This metal spell is not the only good metal blast introduced in this book. There's one on the next slide as well. So between this and the next one, Elemental Metal Bloodline Sorcerers, if you're not satisfied with lightning-themed spells attached to your character because, like, you wanted to do metal, not electromagnetism, feel free to ask your GMs to homebrew these. There are enough metal spells now that you can get into exactly the character fantasy you want, but it needs a little bit of homebrew. Next up, I wanted to talk about Living Terrain. And oh boy, this is such a fantastic spell. I have always been a sucker for 2-action spells that do less damage up front and then you sustain for round after round continuous damage. Floating Flame, Cinder Swarm, and this is directly comparable to them. It does 1d6 less damage than either of them, but it has a bigger area than Floating Flame. The area moves more flexibly than either of the spells because Floating Flame's area moves 10 feet at a time, whereas this one moves 15 feet at a time while being bigger at a baseline. And unlike Cinder Swarm, you have control over where it moves. It's not based on your enemy's choices. And of course, this spell inflicts Clumsy 1 on even a successful saving throw on the target of your spell, and it deals Clumsy 2 on a critical failure. And on a failure or critical failure, they are knocked prone. This is such an exceptionally cool spell. Really, the only problem is that it does not heighten as aggressively as Cinder Swarm, so as you level up, it will be harder to justify using it, but I would say that for the level 7 till 12-ish range, this is a good spell that you should be considering. It doesn't even need to come out of your maximum rank slot, because a little bit of poke damage that makes enemies clumsy almost all the time and also potentially makes them prone is so powerful and so impactful that you could definitely get away with the poor heightening. Maybe you can even continue using it into high-level play. Definitely on primal casters who don't tend to get that many crazy natively high-ranked spells, so they're more than okay just heightening what they have. But yeah, I love this spell, and it's also incredibly thematic and cool aside from being mechanically powerful. Next up, Force Rain, a nice counterpart to Iron Rain, and this is a really good flexible action spell. Thematically, the idea is that this is kind of like a force barrage that then you're like exploding shrapnel out of rather than pinpoint targeting at people. The 2-action version is a bog standard AoE. 10-foot burst, 8d6 force damage, so like a smaller fireball at this rank. The 1-action version does half the damage and is a 5-foot square, so it's effectively a single target version. And the 3-action version has the same AoE template, but rather than offering a save, it does 20 automatic damage. The average of 8d6 is 26 damage. Those who succeed would be taking 13 damage, and those who critically fail would be taking 52 damage. So the 3-action version is a really good low floor, low risk option, while the 2-action version is the spikier one, the one that works like more traditional blasting spells where you're hoping to spike a fail or a crit fail on at least one target. The heightening for this seems pretty smooth overall, and notably, I really like the 1-action version of this spell. 1-action reliable damage from a considerably lower rank spell slot actually just makes for a pretty good 3rd action. And unlike something like, say, Force Barrage, this heightens smoothly. The 2 spells that come to mind when I talk about low-rank 1-action spells that you might use as a 3rd action while you yourself are much higher than their native rank are Force Barrage and Blazing Bolt. Both of these have a distinct reason that makes them slightly worse at this role than Force Rain. Force Barrage does not heighten smoothly, so when you're level 5 and firing, say, a throwaway 1st rank 1-action Force Barrage, it feels decent. But when you're level 7, your 1st and 2nd rank Force Barrages both feel negligible. Then you become level 9 and your 3rd rank one feels decent again, and so on and so forth. That is Force Barrage's disadvantage. Blazing Bolt's disadvantage is having the attack trait. This both means that because attacks tend to be a little more unreliable for a caster, you're either gambling or you're relying on a bit of setup, and no one's really going to invest in setting you up for a 1-action spell. The 2-action ones are worth it, the 1-action ones not so much. This is actually a pretty good go-to 3rd action for spellcasters that are at level 10 or higher. using a spell from a few ranks below your max, doing half-scaling single target damage on a simple reflex save, and then doing whatever else with your remaining 2 actions. This is a really good spell, and these sorts of flexible spells really help casters shine, especially prepared casters who really like using multimodal spells. Next up, I wanted to talk about what might be the coolest spell thus far, maybe the coolest spell that I have seen in the book, Ember Doppelganger. This spell is a 5th rank, 3 action arcane and primal spell. Its range says 30 feet, but it's secretly not 30 feet, as you will see. What it does is creates a fiery duplicate of you. Each time you cast the spell or sustain, it will stride 30 feet and then launch a blast of fire in a 10-foot burst 30 feet away. And this is why I said the range is not really 30 feet. What you really have for range is 100 feet of range, 90 of which completely bypasses line of effect rules as long as a path exists to your enemies. It also bypasses cover for this exact reason. And that burst does 6d6 fire damage, which isn't a lot. That's effectively a 3rd rank fireball the first time you cast a spell and each time you sustain the spell. This might not seem like a lot, but think about how hard it is for the enemy to get away from this. I just talked about Living Earth being a good spell, but all an enemy needs to do to get away from Living Earth is spend an action getting so far away from it that you probably wouldn't bother sustaining it to chase them. Likewise for Floating Flame. Ember Doppelganger is crazy hard to get away from by comparison. You're almost certainly not moving away from it because effectively this Doppelganger can move 30 feet and then launch the blast 30 feet away each time you sustain the spell. The enemy is much less likely to move 70 plus feet away from the Doppelganger, whereas for Living Earth or Floating Flame, something like 30 feet is usually more than enough. And second, the enemy could certainly choose to attack the Doppelganger. It has a lot of HP. It has 50 HP and is immune to critical hits and precision damage, and it's immune to immobilize, prone, and restrain. So it's not like the enemy can just use an on-hit rider to stop it from moving around. It is also secretly immune to slowed and stunned, because if you notice, it doesn't actually gain actions at all. The actions are just based on you sustaining and it gets them for free. So it's not like they can slow down this creature either. So they have no way of slowing down this creature. They have no way of running away from this creature. And hitting it, they have to work through 50 HP without being able to crit. That is almost certainly going to take 2 to 4 actions to break through. So effectively, anytime you cast a spell, the enemy has this dilemma. Do I let the player hit me with a 3rd rank fireball every single turn for 1 action henceforth, after having already taken a 3rd rank fireball to start? Or do I lose somewhere between 2 to 4 actions, potentially taking map to deal with this Doppelganger? And remember, it's 2 to 4 actions of straight attacking. But you could have just summoned this Doppelganger a little further away from the enemy, so they would have to first move to the Doppelganger, then attack it a minimum of 2 times, potentially up to 4 times, and then come back to the battlefield if, say, your party members did not give them chase. This is such a good continuous damage spell. This is going to be a staple on blasters I built from this point onwards. Next up, there is Stop Heart. This is an 8th rank single target spell that targets Fortitude, which makes it directly compete with spells like Boil Blood or Execute. This deals the same damage as Boil Blood, but rather than inflicting Drain and only on a failure, this inflicts Sickened, and it does so on a success as well. This is a fantastic single target spell. This is amazing going into facing bosses. This is also going to be a high rank staple. Then there is Metallic Meteorite Glyph. And this spell is also just incredibly cool. If Stop Heart will be a staple for single target damage, this is going to be a staple for flexibility. The 2-action version is just a single target 120-foot range spell that deals 8d12 bludgeoning damage. That makes it like a significantly worse scaling Thunderstrike at the baseline 2-action version. I don't know that I would use the 2-action version because at this point, not only is a heightened Thunderstrike outscaling it, you have access to things like Stop Heart, So again, the main use case for the 2-action version would be you are a prepared spellcaster, you prepared this as your multimodal spell, and you're out of other good single target options. Then there's a 3-action version that does that same damage to up to 3 different creatures within range. This is, again, decent. The 3-action version is not doing that much damage. You're only really valuing this option for its flexibility. You wouldn't use this unless you were caught with only this prepared. But the 2-round version is what I wanted to highlight. Note the wording here. On the second turn, you only need 2 actions now, not 3. And the way this works is you deal the initial damage to 3 different creatures, who then continue taking 6d12 bludgeoning damage round after round at the end of each of their turns. So the 2-round version is what I would pick this spell for. The way the damage is templated, 8d12 up front, and then 6d12 right away at the enemy's next turn's ending, it sort of makes it buy back the loss in tempo of spending 2 rounds on a spell. The damage profile will feel akin to an incarnate spell, something like Summon Draconic Legion, but a little slower than that, and a lot more flexible than that, because you can use the 3 and 2 action versions of it in a pinch. Is this a generically good spell? I don't think so, and I almost certainly would not pick it on a spontaneous caster. On a prepared caster, I will consider it for its multimodality. Then there is Tear the Veil. This is a 10th rank blast, and 10th rank blasts typically have the issue that they're not worth casting with your one and only slot. Like Cataclysm, it's cool and epic, and it does do a lot of damage. The amount of damage it does is not high enough to justify spending your one and only 10th rank slot, 1 of 2 if you spent your capstone feat on it, on the spell. It's just not. I don't think I could justify casting Cataclysm. But this spell is how you do 10th rank blasts. It creates a 60-foot burst within 300 feet. It stays over there. You have to sustain it with your actions, but it stays. And it deals 10d12 damage on a failure. Half that on a success, double that on a critical failure. It also pulls enemies towards the center on every single outcome other than a critical success. And first off, force movement is valuable. When you're fighting a whole bunch of enemies, pulling a bunch of them out of the front line and letting the rest of your party members focus on the ones who didn't get pulled is inherently nice. Pulling enemies towards the center of a blast is fundamentally awesome. But then there's the fact that since the whole area is difficult terrain, pulling them to the center of the blast means it's more difficult for them to get out of there, which means you might get multiple pings of damage on them. And then even further on top of that, the center 5-foot burst of this spell starts inflicting drain on any creature who is touching it. If a creature has any spatial overlap with that burst, they immediately become drained 1 when their turn starts. If they were already drained, it increases further. And this is where this spell can start spiraling. You position it right, you pull maybe a couple of enemies closer to the center, and maybe 1 or 2 are touching the center, and now they're drained 1, which means the next time you sustain a spell, they're more likely to fail or critically fail their saving throw, which means they're going to get pulled further into this area of difficult terrain, which then might further drain them. And there is the thing where once you become drained 4, you have to make a fortitude save or become a wraith. Realistically, that is just flavor. It is so unlikely to happen. The amount of damage you would be doing to a creature while they're getting all the way up to drain 4, they will almost certainly drop dead before you get anywhere close to making them a wraith. But it is cool flavor for sure, because the flavor of the spell is that you're literally summoning void energy into the universe, and it is destroying reality around them, right? This is how you make a good 10th rank blast. And with that, I feel like Impossible Magic did a really good job rounding out blasts for all ranks of play, both with the attack spells I showed earlier, which was not an exhaustive list, and with these spells I showed now, which is also not an exhaustive list, even though I showed you 7 awesome spells. Next up, I wanted to talk about some Gish-focused spells. And despite the fact that a lot of people think Gish must necessarily mean Magus, Not all of these spells were made for the Magus, just like how not all attack trait spells are made for the Magus. Of course, some of these are also going to be good on the Magus because the Magus is a Gish. I'm just saying there are other Gishes in the game, like War Priest Clerics, Warrior Bards, War Mage and Rune Lord Wizards, and various builds you can make with the Druid. First up, an innocuous rank 1 spell, but it's a crazy effect. It feels like it must be exploitable. There must be something really, really stupid you can do with it. The gist is this. If you are an arcane, occult, or primal spellcaster with a free hand, and you're willing to spend 2 actions in a rank 1 spell slot while touching a creature, that creature is now attached to you. There is no saving throw for this. And once the creature is stuck to you, if they're smaller than you, then they're fully immobilized. You can still move, but they are immobilized. Anytime you move, they get pulled along. If they are the same size as you, then both of you can move, pulling the other along, and both of you treat your movements as difficult terrain. If the target is larger than you, you are the one who is immobilized, and you get pulled along when they move. Pretty simple effect, and the other target can choose to escape from it. It takes an escape action against your spell DC. You can just dismiss the spell with a single action. And I'm sure there must be some kind of an exploit you can do with this, like somehow carry enemies up into the air and drop them or whatever. But the main use case I see for this is for tanks. Tanks in the front line, like say a tanky Magus. You might just want to stick onto an enemy and then drag them away from combat. I have talked about Juggernaut Charge being a fantastic tanking tool for the Guardian to basically get to an enemy and get them out of your ally's reach in case they're threatening an ally who shouldn't be in melee. Stick On is an incredibly reliable way of doing so. Every other way of doing this requires some kind of an attack roll or saving throw to push the enemy or drag them or whatever. This one has no check attached. If you're already in melee, immobilize the enemy, drag them with you if you're larger than them, the end. If you're the same size as them, you can also make an attempt to drag them with you so long as the difficult terrain isn't making things too bad. So I don't know, innocuous looking rank 1 spell, at first glance you might not even think of it as a combat relevant spell. I think this spell has the potential to be something exploitable and broken. Next, I wanted to talk about Fulminating Impact. This is not some spectacularly powerful spell, but this is sort of a showcase of what I meant, both when I said that Gishes don't have to be Maguses, they can be other spellcasters, and for when I said that this book is trying to give spellcasters encouragement to go into melee. You will notice again and again that touch range effects are pretty powerful in Impossible Magic spells, and this particular spell requires a melee strike. And if you hit, you deal 2d6 extra damage, and then your strikes start dealing 1 additional electricity damage and 1 additional sonic damage for the duration of the spell. This is kind of like a baby spell strike combined with a baby draw the lightning. And it costing a 4th rank slot feels like niche protection for the Magus, because casters like a War Mage Wizard or a Druid or whatever is not going to be able to do it until like a higher level, and at that point the Magus is also spell striking with a lot of their lower rank slots, so it feels like an even trade, because the Magus will still have the most impactful spell strikes, and you will have this baby spell strike you spent a somewhat valuable slot on. It does heighten at rank 8, not by a lot, it's only like 6 additional damage up front, and on average an extra 2.5 damage for the continuous effect, but it is a nice boost to damage if you're intending to use the spell. Ultimately, I did not highlight the spell for its power, but for its interestingness, because it does enable a playstyle that, until now, was not that well supported. Being a spellcaster who wants to incorporate melee strikes into your spells, rather than the other way around, which is what Maguses do, incorporating spells onto their strikes. Next up, I wanted to talk about what might genuinely be the most broken spell in this book, and I am not using that phrase lightly. I don't just go around calling things broken when they're slightly ahead of the curve. I genuinely think this spell is warpingly broken. Like, an arcane or primal caster not picking it is making a mistake. So it is a 6th rank spell named Living Thunderbolt. It has a duration of a minute. It gives you a fly speed of 60. It gives you resistance 10 to electricity. And it gives you the effects of unfettered movement. And then you are allowed to move through creature spaces as if they weren't there, though you can't end your movement there. And any creature that you move through this way takes 6d12 electricity damage with a basic reflex save. For a little bit of a ballpark of how good this is, Chain Lightning is a 6th rank spell that does 8d12 damage once to all of the creatures that it hits, right? This one does 6d12 damage on that first turn when you spend 3 actions, 2 to cast the spell, 1 to move through all of them, and then turn after turn, you can again and again and again do 6d12 damage. And for any target that failed their saving throw, they are dazzled. So you are doing less damage than a Chain Lightning up front, but you're getting a nice rider on top, and you can keep repeating this damage. Remember earlier when I was talking about how Ember Doppelganger, Cinder Swarm, and Living Terrain are good spells for doing round after round damage? I am ignoring Floating Flame here because it is a very low rank spell. It's okay for it to have fallen off by this point. But if you compare to these other 3 spells that are already good enough to be staples, this comes out clearly ahead, with the only real downside being that on turn 1, you have to use 3 actions, not 2. And I know a few people who are not familiar with polymorph spells are going to assume that if you use Living Thunderbolt, you can't cast spells thereafter because you're polymorphed. That isn't actually true. You can cast spells while polymorphed. You just can't cast spells when your polymorph has the words battle form in its name. So for example, you could always polymorph into Fiery Body or Ferrous form and still cast spells because those are not battle forms. And this is not a battle form either. So this will just mean that after your first turn, where you're taking a slight tempo hit because you're spending 3 actions to do below par damage up front, though still potentially dazzling enemies, you'd be doing round after round of 5th rank lightning bolts for 1 action, and still have your remaining 2 actions to cast a spell. And because your 1 action has a stride up to 60 feet built in, so long as you're not provoking something like Reactive Strike, you're most likely going to be able to cast the spell, because oftentimes when you're sustaining a spell or spending 1 action on damage, not being able to stride into your optimal position is a legitimate downside. This takes away that downside. You're striding and sustaining your damage and leaving 2 actions left over to do something else with, presumably casting another 2-action spell. This spell is too good. And honestly, I don't want it to be too good because it is so thematic and cool. You're turning yourself into lightning. I want it to be just good enough to use, but like not so good that it's gonna get errata, but I think it is good enough that it's gonna get errata. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we'll find out that this is just a fine spell to have in the meta, so to speak, and nothing's gonna break. Let's see. Next up, Comet Charge. Feel free to pause and read through the effect, but the gist is that it's a 2-action gap closer spell. So when I say gap closer spells, I mean things like Blazing Dive, Dive and Breach, although that's more of a gap creator spell. And of course, Blink Charge. This is a 7th rank variant. You fly up to 120 feet, which is a massive amount of flight, larger than any other of the gap closer spells. And then you make a melee spell attack. So again, this isn't something you would use on a Magus, because if you spell strike with it, you don't get to move before you make that spell strike. And if you just cast the spell, it's going to be based on your spell attack, not on your weapon attack. So this is very much a Gish spell for non-Maguses. You can move through creatures, and you don't trigger reactions while doing so. Then the target of the attack takes a bunch of damage, depending on the element you chose. Comet of Fire has the highest of the damage, 14d6 fire damage, and then some of the other comets have rider effects, like Comet of Ice, slowing enemies down. Comet of Lightning is probably the most generically strong of the options because it does 6d12 fire damage, which is not that far behind what you would expect from Comet of Fire, but it dazzles on a hit. Comet of Rust is probably the more situational of the options, and Comet of Splinters is probably the strongest debuff if you're not trying to dazzle the enemy but rather want to just numerically worsen them, because it inflicts Clumsy on a hit. Overall, I really like this spell. This spell, again, is justification for casters to go into melee, and I always love to see more of that, and is also fantastic and powerful and thematic. Then we have Amalgamizing Leap. And full disclosure, I am not sure if this is going to be a good spell or a bad spell, but it is definitely an interesting spell that deserves a closer look. So it's actually pretty complicatedly worded, but the way it works is this. You choose a creature and a space within range. The space does not have to be associated with the creature, like it's not like an adjacent space, it can be anywhere. Then the creature is going to make a save. Set aside what happens to the creature for a moment. You will always teleport to that chosen space. This is a given. This is still going to happen even if the creature critically succeeds. What changes is what happens to the creature. On a critical success, nothing. On a success, they become enfeebled 1 and you gain 20 temp HP as you steal part of their bulk with you. On a failure, they're fully amalgamated into your body. This means that 1, they cannot act until the end of your next turn. They're simply gone from the battlefield. They get no actions, they don't get to do anything. They don't even occupy a space, they cannot be affected by anything, be it enemies or friends. While you're fused together, you gain 40 temp HP, you steal any of the speeds the target has if they're higher than yours or if they're a speed you wouldn't otherwise have, you gain all of their special senses, and your reach increases by 5 feet. Also, on a critical failure, the target becomes sickened 1 once they detach from you, but they still do suffer the whole effects of the failure first. I don't know if this is a good spell or a bad spell. It's definitely a cool spell. You'd be crazy to disagree with that. The way I would like to use it is perhaps as a gap closer, and this can apply to Gishes, but honestly any spellcaster can justify doing this. You will teleport anyways, so if you had a reason you wanted to be in melee, just choose a space adjacent to the creature you're trying to absorb. And then, if they fail, you will just take them out of the battlefield. And at that point, you can make the decision. Now that you have like stolen them and amalgamated them into you, do you just want to run away from them? Like, do you just want to take them away from the front line? That is a decision you can make. But I am viewing this as something that lets you teleport 60 feet, most likely gain at least 20 temp HP, and potentially take an enemy completely off the battlefield while gaining 40 temp HP instead. It does have the incapacitation trait. You're not going to be using this on a boss, but honestly, this is rank 8. If you were dealing with the boss and you want to put them in timeout, you would cast Quandary. So this is not trying to compete with Quandary in that regard. This is trying to be a gap closer that happens to have a devastating, incapacitating effect. So again, I'm not 100% sure that this is a good spell, but this is definitely a cool spell, and it's worth studying, seeing how to use it. And that covers most of the interesting Gish spells I saw in the book. There are a few that I might not have mentioned, but again, lots of justification for casters to go in melee, lots of Magus options, lots of non-Magus Gish options. Next up, I wanted to talk about debuffing spells. The first one that stood out to me was Disorienting Flash. This is a flexible action spell, and notably, it's available on all 4 traditions. It's a 60-foot range and targets basic fortitude as its save. The 2-action version is Noise Blast that also dazzles. 2d10 sonic damage, creatures that fail become dazzled. The 3-action version is nothing too spectacular. The area gets much larger, but it's still the same damage, and on a failure they become dazzled and deafened. But deafened is a fairly situational condition, so I don't see myself using the 3-action version of this too much. I like this mainly for the 2-action version because, like I said, it feels like a noise blast that dazzles, which is certainly a nice debuffing blast to have in your pocket, especially for divine and occult spellcasters. And the 1-action version is the one that's really interesting. It deals 1d10 sonic damage, and if you look at the way this heightens, this actually heightens better than Force Rain that I showed you earlier. At the rank that Force Rain is, if you heighten this up till there, it's already doing more damage than that 4th rank spell, and it scales better beyond that point too, and more aggressively. So for 1 action, this is pretty good damage for a 60-foot range basic save, and it preserves a chance of dazzling the creature. Again, it's a 5-foot square, just like Force Rain's 1-action version, so you're not AoEing with this unless your GM is throwing tiny creatures at you, but the reliable damage coming from a spell below your ranks, and this is a low rank spell, so this is going to start early, like level 7, level 8-ish, and it's nice. You can just use a throwaway third action this way to do a little bit of poke damage and potentially dazzle a foe. This is why I put it with the debuffers, because this fits better into a debuffers turns rather than a blaster. A blaster is much more likely to use a one-action focus spell or something that does a bit more damage in some capacity, whereas a debuffer can certainly justify using this. Like, one action for poke damage and maybe dazzling a foe? Pretty damn nice. Next up, there is Unrelenting Gravity. This is an arcane and occult spell and targets a fortitude save for a creature within 30 feet. On a success, they are encumbered for a round. And encumbered is a good condition. It inflicts clumsy 1 on the foe, and it reduces their speeds. So the success effect isn't as good as, say, Fear, because Frightened is definitely better than clumsy 1, though one can argue that the speed makes this a side grade. The speed downside is something your party will have to coordinate with you to utilize. But what makes this spell worth looking at is the failure and critical failure effects proning the enemy. That makes this spell pretty good. Having Encumbered as your consolation prize, but potentially getting an enemy prone, is really nice. And at 4th rank, you can target 5 creatures with this, which makes this a fantastic multi-target spell. And it does have some marginal upsides against flying enemies, and this might work for, say, an enemy that is flying only like 10 feet off the ground. So you don't care about bringing them down to the ground as like a silver bullet, just getting them down is a nice effect to have. Next up, Friends to Foes. This is a 4th rank spell that is largely just a side grade to Vision of Death. It does less damage than Vision of Death, and it has a shorter range. But as long as it is within 10 feet of an ally, it cannot reduce its frightened condition. And notably, it doesn't say cannot reduce the frightened condition below 1, like a lot of other similar spells might say. It says cannot reduce the frightened condition at all. So if they fail, they're frightened 2 until they move away from an ally. If they critically fail, they're frightened 2 and confused until they move away from an ally, because their frightened 2 is just not ticking down, and your friends can just not hit them and hit somebody else to leave the confused condition in place. And at 7th rank, this heightens to target 5 creatures. That being said, it does not scale in damage the way, say, Vision of Death or Mist Q would, so it does fall off heavily in that regard. I don't know if I would target 5 creatures with it. Maybe the effect is strong enough that I still would, like frightening a whole bunch of creatures, dealing a bit of poke damage, and then potentially confusing one of them does still seem relevant. I do wish the damage scaled a little though, especially for a 30-foot range spell. That being said, this is still a pretty good debuff spell. And finally, Weight of the World, which is a fantastic rank 5 debuffing spell. This is an arcane or occult spell that targets 120 feet away. The defense it targets is Fortitude, dealing 2d12 bludgeoning and 1d12 persistent bleed damage. On success, failure, critical failure, half, full, double. That is ultimately just poke damage, but the debuff is crazy. Anything but a critical success dazzles the foe. Success dazzles the foe for a round and inflicts stunned 1. Failure dazzles them for a minute and inflicts stunned 2. Critical failure dazzles them for a minute and inflicts stunned 3. This is an exceptionally good spell. This is such a good single target debuff that it competes with Synesthesia, and Synesthesia is an incredible single target debuff. The only other single target debuff that comes close to Synesthesia's value is Blister Bomb, and this is now yet another strong contender. And I find it a little crazy that this spell does not have the incapacitation trait, because usually things that fully take an enemy out, even for a round, via something like Stunned 3 or the Amalgamation spell you saw earlier, they usually have the incapacitation trait. It is crazy to me that this doesn't, and I'm glad it doesn't, because that gives us an amazing new debuff spell, including for occult casters who are a little tired of using Synesthesia. And with that, we are mostly done talking about debuffs, but I wanted to highlight two more debuffs that stood out to me, specifically because they inflict the sickened condition. And sickened is an important condition to analyze because anytime a debuff is inflicting this condition, it gets directly compared to the greatest of all time debuff spell, Blister Bomb. Also notably, these spells are not going to be banned in Pathfinder Society most likely, so you can actually use them. These are the two spells I'm talking about, Bone Moth's Kiss and Corpse Bloom. Both are direct side grades to Blister Bomb because of the exact rank they're at and the fact that they use the sickened condition. Bone Moth's Kiss is an occult and primal spell that has a pretty similar effect to Blister Bomb. The main difference is that on success it does sickened 1, while Blister Bomb does sickened 2. I think that makes Blister Bomb directly better than Bone Moth's Kiss, especially because Blister Bomb is a small AoE which will mostly be single target, occasionally multi-target, and doesn't seem to have the same targeting restrictions. They both have the disease trait, mind you, but this one specifies that the other creature needs to have bones or an exoskeleton. So I do think Blister Bomb is better than this. On a failure and critical failure, this spell inflicts the Bone Moth's Kiss disease, which is again similar to Blister Bomb having its own affliction. This one, rather than starting a sickened 2, starts with drained 1 and sickened 1, and progresses from there with the drained condition increasing. Would I use this if I could access Blister Bomb? No, I wouldn't. But occult spellcasters can't access Blister Bomb, and they should consider this spell. This is a really good debuff, even if it's not as good as Blister Bomb. And of course, if you're playing in Pathfinder Society, even Primal casters should consider the spell. And then the second one, Corpse Bloom. I'm really excited about this. It's a 3-action spell that creates 3 5-foot bursts that don't overlap. Right off the bat, this is a really flexible area. Being able to put multiple small area of effects around the battlefield is much more ally-friendly than having one large effect that hits the same number of targets. You can even maneuver this around allies who are already engaged in melee. / if you were to put it up proactively, you can spread things up enough that your allies can get through them as long as they're paying attention. Creatures that start their turn in the area or enter it for the first time on a round take 3d4 poison damage on a fortitude save. 3d4 is a pittance of damage at this level. It's less than what cantrips do, but the main gimmick of the spell is that even on a success, they're sickened 1, and on a critical failure, they're sickened 2. This spell, especially when cast on an already engaged set of foes that are perhaps close in level to the party, makes for a fantastic option. And an enemy that wants to stop being sickened is actually going to have to pay a hefty action tax, because first they have to leave the cluster they were in that caused them to be sickened in the first place, and then try to retch. So most of the time, enemies might just leave the cluster to stop taking the damage, but I don't think they will immediately retch. I think they will just have to deal with the debuff for a turn or two before they get a window to retch, if they're even alive that long. So I think Corpse Bloom is a fantastic primal spell that is a worthwhile area denial / debuff at rank 3, and Bone Moth's Kiss is a nice way to access a Blister Bomb-like effect on occult casters or primal casters in PFS. Both fantastic debuffs, and with that, we will close our debuffs chapter. Now, we can start talking about controlling spells. And note here, if you look at any of these spells and you're like, that's not a controlling spell, Mathfinder, that should have been a debuff. Or vice versa, if you look at one of the debuffs and we're like, that should have come in control, sure, you might be right. Control versus debuff is ultimately very vibes-based. These are just the spells I pulled into the control section. And Corpse Bloom was probably like the borderline spell where it's like it falls just on the side of control, and if I didn't have like a dedicated sickened slide, I would have put it over here rather than there. First up, Dimensional Drop. And at first glance, this seems comical because there's this meme in the Pathfinder community where Paizo sometimes writes bombastic flavor text for things, and then the effect is incredibly minor. For example, they recently released this feat, which I think is like a level 6 or level 8 feat, where the whole flavor goes into how you are going through the determination of somebody who goes to the Starstone test, this, that, all the people who came before you, and then the effect is just step and strike, basically a skirmish strike. And if I recall correctly, it's a little worse than skirmish strike, but don't quote me on that. This, at first glance, feels like one of those spells. You place a portal on the ground directly beneath a creature. They immediately plummet into extra-dimensional space, falling through infinite, featureless void before being forcibly ejected from a portal that appears right above their original space and taking the appropriate fall damage. And then, when you read the effect, it's just like 10 feet, 20 feet, or 40 feet of falling. Like, you look at the spell and you're like, wow, I'm gonna put somebody in like an infinite time cage like Doctor Strange to Loki in that one movie. But no, it's just a small drop. And you might dismiss the spell after reading, and maybe you'll have a nice laugh about piezo flavor text. But this spell is actually still fantastic. It's a second rank spell that will prone an enemy on any outcome other than a critical success. That's a uniquely powerful controlling effect, and at 5th rank, it heightens to 5 creatures within range. This is a fantastic debuffing / controlling effect, depending on what you want to consider it. If enemies are far away from you, this is mostly like a controlling effect, because you're preventing them from approaching you safely while also giving them a little bit of poke damage along the way. If they're close to you, this is a devastating effect, because this is the most reliable way for a spellcaster to get an enemy prone. And once you get the enemy prone, them standing up might trigger your martial allies' reactive strikes. So the next time you want to talk about spells being more reliable than skills, and someone's like, actually, athletic skills are so good and spells don't do anything like athletic skills, throw them into a Doctor Strange dimension, I guess. Because now you can drop enemies prone with an incredibly high consistency with this spell. And unlike an athletics user, you don't need to crit to do a little bit of damage along the way either. Next up, Lightning Lasso, which is thematically just Thunderstrike being used a little bit differently, so you try to bind an enemy with your lightning. And you might scoot over this because it says 2d12 damage, and our instinct is to assume that you do half that damage on a success. Like you saw with some of the other spells before, where I said they do worse than Thunderstrike damage, because Thunderstrike does rank d12 of damage plus rank d4, whereas those other spells were doing rank d12, like the Magnetic Meteorite spell, for example, where the one action version just did 8d12 to one target. And this one seems even worse than that, because 2d12, not even 3d12. But look at it again. It's 2d12 on a success. And then on a failure, the target is immobilized. It can choose to escape, and if they choose to stay immobilized instead, each time you sustain the spell, they will take 2 electricity damage automatically and remain immobilized. So if an enemy is far away from you, you can kind of lock them out of combat until they escape. If an enemy is in melee, you can put them in a dilemma. Waste actions on escaping or keep taking some damage. And on a critical failure, the target gets restrained. This is a really cool and really powerful controlling spell. And like all spells with immobilize attached as a condition, teamwork will make this one really shine. And next up, Fractious Echo. Again, a Doctor Strange reference. Make a melee strike that deals bludgeoning damage. If you hit, the target is pushed 10 feet away, 20 feet away if you get critically hit, and when they do so, their spirit is actually left in the original space. The Echo cannot take any actions, but anyone can choose to target the Echo as if that was just the original target. It has no resistance, no special defenses. Targeting the Echo is no different than hitting the original target. And there's the standard wording of if AoEs include both of them, only one of them is affected. This is a fantastic spell. Remember earlier when I was talking about Juggernaut Charge and the new spell Stick On, where a tanky character might want to clear a threat from an ally, like a squishy ally has a threat near them, and the tank will now try and get them out of there. That is already a fundamentally good thing to do. Having the option to do so only in terms of the enemy's offenses, so prevent them from threatening your ally immediately, but still letting everyone else attack their Echo where they used to be, is fantastic. This also means that you can exploit force movement against, say, a frontline enemy by pushing them back into an area damaging effect or an area controlling effect, while still letting your melee allies hit them for the next round. And at the end of that next round, maybe this echo disappears and the enemy hasn't closed back in, but that's a good thing for you. The enemy staying inside that horrible area of whatever other spell you're comboing this with is just good for you. This is such a cool and unique effect, and it does seem to be made for Gishy spellcasters. It might not be the most individually powerful spell, you can certainly get stronger controlling and debuffing effects at 3rd rank, but it's got such a unique effect for you to coordinate with your party around, and I think that makes it worth highlighting. Next up, Skyglass Prison, which feels sort of like a hybrid between the slow spell and the containment spell. And this is sort of an important point to highlight because the primal list, which does get this spell, does not get containment, and that is nice. It targets fortitude, and as part of the casting of the spell, it creates a little cage with 10 AC, 5 hardness, 30 HP, immunity to critical hits, and precision damage. The HP scales by 10 per rank. When a creature escapes the cage or the cage is destroyed, they will also take 3d4 slashing damage, which heightens 1d4 per rank. You can also dismiss the spell to destroy it if you just wish to deal the damage. On a critical success, nothing happens. On a success, the target is immobilized until it escapes or until the cage is destroyed. The cage does get automatically destroyed at the start of your next turn, but this isn't as big a deal as you might think, because if you use this on an enemy who, say, was trying to close the gap with you, they're probably going to have to spend the actions to escape if they want to do anything useful. Remember, this is not like containment. When you use containment on a creature, your allies can't target them either, so it's only useful for divide and conquer strategies. If you immobilize an enemy with this, your allies can still hit that enemy, just if they don't close in a melee, that enemy is still going to be forced to have to escape or attack the chains to get away from there, or they'd have to delay past your next turn if they just want to wait for the cage to go away. On a failure, the cage's auto-destruction clause is just not there, so now they just have to escape or destroy the cage. And on a critical failure, they are restrained, which means they can take no actions other than to escape. They actually can't even attempt to destroy the cage. I do think escaping is the more reliable option. 30 HP with 5 hardness while being immune to critical hits? That is a lot. It may not seem like a lot when you're just staring at the numbers, but trust me, I have cast a lot of containments in the past. They work exceptionally well. It's a lot of HP and hardness to break through, and obviously this is not as much HP and hardness, it's still a good amount. This is a powerful controlling spell. The only real limitation of the spell is the 30-foot range, which limits that use case where you would use it on an enemy who's far away and taking a turn after you. But it's still a really good spell, and you can always use Reach spell on it if desired. I will also note here, this is really good against flying enemies. If the flying enemy does not successfully escape from the cage, they just fall because they were not allowed to take a fly action while they were immobilized. And because escape has a multiple attack penalty against any non-boss enemy, it has a decent chance of causing them to fall, and against a boss, while it may not necessarily cause them to fall, they're almost certainly going to escape with their first or second attempt. It's going to drain 1 or 2 actions away. So like if you're fighting a dragon and that dragon is in the air trying to breathe fire down on you, simply using this spell takes away its action advantage, which means now your party might be dealing more damage to it at range than it is to you. And now it might just choose to close the gap with you to level the odds a little bit. Likewise, if the enemy was not planning on kiting you, if they were planning on, say, running in and then using some kind of a 2-action multi-strike action, like Draconic Frenzy if we go with that dragon example, although many other creatures have it, this will deny them the opportunity of doing so, and it'll do so in a way that's slightly higher upside than slow, because slow only takes away 1 action if the enemy succeeds. This might take away more than 1 action, because there's multiple checks attached to getting out. And if they critically fail, it's really bad for them. Then there is Horizon's Veil. This is not an exceptionally powerful spell or anything. This is actually a very situational spell. I considered putting it in the silver bullet section later. But it is a cool area control spell, and I kind of wanted to highlight it because it's kind of sticking in my mind because of how good it would have been in the combat I GM'd from a party 2 days ago, as of the day I recorded this video. It just bullies characters who want to stay far away from you and attack you from range. First off, it gives a -2 circumstance penalty to all ranged attack rolls that go through the area. Notably, this penalty is not limited to physical projectiles like, say, Wall of Wind, which is also a good anti-ranged tool. This just fully penalizes all attack rolls. And secondly, any creature who ends their turn in the area has a chance of becoming slowed 1. This is a pretty good control spell to use if you're closing the gap with an enemy who wants to stay far away from you, or to just force them out of the place they were trying to stay far away from you. I will also add that even in melee, this might be worth casting just as a huge area that each turn will potentially slow enemies, somewhat akin to the Stagnate Time spell. And finally, for control spells, I wanted to talk about Fiendish Rift. This is a divine-only spell, and it does have the Unholy trait. Maybe that's why Paizo made it so powerful, because it's like only a few casters are ever going to use this spell, and it's really powerful. The effect is most comparable to something like Grasp of the Deep or Slither. It's actually most directly comparable to Slither. Fortitude saving throw, a bunch of damage, half on a success and no rider, full damage and grabbed on a failure, double damage and restrained on a critical failure. But now if you go back to Slither and compare it, this spell is so much better. It does half damage on success, Slither does none. On the full damage case, on a failure, it does more damage up front than Slither does, including its persistent damage. In fact, Slither's persistent damage would have to take twice to catch up to this, which means that if the enemy spends a second turn in the area, there's no chance Slither is catching up in damage. And Slither offers allies a way to help enemies get out of it, whereas Fiendish Rift offers no such option. This also does additional damage to Holy Trait enemies, separate from any unholy weakness they might possess. This is a fantastic controlling spell, and I wish it wasn't unholy. I wish it was available to all divine spellcasters. Next up, I wanted to cover the most cinematic spell, and I actually glossed over this when I was doing the first run of this video. I got to this in a re-record after somebody pointed it out to me on Discord. Stars of Another Sky. And first off, just the most cinematic spell by far. You replace the sky with a mesmerizing vision of the astral plane's river of souls, and people are so mesmerized by it that they start getting pulled towards their own final fates. The way it works is this. It is a 3-action, non-primal, rank 8 spell. It creates a 30-foot radius, 200-foot tall cylinder, targets will, and sustains up to a minute. When you cast and when you sustain the spell, the creature gets one of the following effects. On a critical success, nothing, and then they're also immune to the spell. On anything success or less, they become fascinated. And on anything failure or less, the fascinated does not end on a hostile action. This might be easy to dismiss because fascinated is not a useful combat condition. But the thing that makes the spell work is that anytime a creature gets fascinated, they rise into the air. 20 feet on a success, 50 feet on a failure, and 100 feet on a critical failure. And this is already pretty incredible. Taking enemies up into the sky, unless of course they possess their own flying speeds, sometimes effectively takes them out of combat. Of course, they might have backup ranged options, but unless they have something fundamentally just meant to be very powerful at range, you're at least severely inconveniencing them, and in a few rare cases, fully locking them out of combat. But that's not where the utility of the spell ends, because when the creature stops being fascinated, there's nothing protecting them from the fall. So if the creature succeeds, and they're fascinated and rise 20 feet into the air, and then one of your allies takes a hostile action that happens to end the fascinated condition, that creature is now going to take 10 damage and fall prone. 10 damage, of course, is a pittance at this level, but falling prone is always a good effect to have on a success, even at rank 8. And failure? This creature went 50 feet in the air. The chances of them being locked out of most of their useful tools are already high. Their fascinated does not end on hostile actions, and then they might rise further up. And if they don't happen to rise further up, they're still probably going to fall and take at least 25 damage and fall prone. And if you happen to raise a creature all the way to the top of the spell, like for example with 4 failures or 2 critical failures, then in the sky, they start taking 5d10 mental damage each time. Automatically, no save attached. And remember, this is a sustained duration spell. At any point, you can just choose to stop sustaining the spell. The fascinated condition will just end on every single creature, and then they'll just fall from whatever heights they're at. I will also note here that Fascinated interrupts the concentrate action, so the most powerful ranged option available to many high-level creatures, spellcasting, can get disrupted. And in fact, even if the creature succeeds on their saving throw, if the party knows they have a dangerous spell, it's often correct to delay past their turn so that a hostile action does not end their Fascinated so that they cannot cast any spells. And of course, on a failure or critical failure, they just can't cast any spells, and hostile actions won't change that. So this spell really effectively locks creatures out of their best actions. The best a creature is going to get to do with judicious use of this spell is some kind of range damage option if they possess one, but most of the time you're going to interrupt the best possible things they can do. And that makes this fantastic for a rank 8 control spell. And I don't use that lightly, because remember, whenever you compare lockout spells at rank 8, you have to compare them to Quandary, the all-star. And this is really good, not in the same circumstances, but equally good in the circumstances that it is designed for. And that is it for covering control spells from Impossible Magic. Blasting and controlling tend to be my 2 favorite ways of playing spellcasters, and honestly, there's so many goodies in here for me that the next 4 characters I play might be spellcasters and I might not be returned to martials for a while. So much for my martial arc for this channel, right? Next up, I wanted to talk about spells that got buffed as part of their remaster. First up, Lucky Number. This spell has changed in one very important way. So the way it works right now is that it is a contingency spell. You roll a d20, and then until your next daily preparations, anytime you roll that number on a non-secret check of any kind, you can use a reaction to re-roll it. And then there's a funny penalty for re-rolling the same number a second time. But the key thing is, previously you rolled a d20 for your preparation number, which meant if you rolled like a high roll, you would just not end up using this reaction. Because, like, I don't know, if you rolled an 18, you wouldn't use it. Why would you re-roll an 18? It's very unlikely you're going to re-roll a 19 or 20 at that point. Now, the initial die you roll is a d10, not a d20. Every outcome you get on this die is guaranteed to be below average. Half of the outcomes you get on this die are guaranteed to be garbage. Now, this is a fantastic spell. This is a contingency I would consider on nearly every character I build that can access this spell, which is, I guess, any non-primal caster. A fantastic buff to an already pretty decent spell. Next up, Inner Radiance Torrent, and this is what I was talking about in the intro slide of this video. 2-round spells used to take 3 actions on the first turn and 3 actions on the second turn. Now, they take 3 actions on the first, 2 on the second, and those 2 actions on the second turn can actually be taken after any other action you take on that turn, so long as you're not casting another spell, which is a huge buff to Inner Radiance Torrent, because Inner Radiance Torrent was kind of not worth using ever since the errata. Before the errata, its 3-action version and 2-action version were good damage for the level, and the 2-round version, in my opinion, was massively overrated. Because yes, it did a lot more damage and it heightened really aggressively, but when you're spending 6 actions standing still, you cannot guarantee that your line will actually hit enemies. Enemies move, allies move, and allies might get in the way of your most optimal possible line. Enemies that move out of there, and unless allies are spending actions to keep them there, it's pretty unlikely they will stay there. I know the 2-round Inner Radiance Torrent used to get a lot of attention. I thought it was the height of White Room optimization. I have actually seen it cast and play. It hit like 2 people and did a nice bunch of damage and felt good. And then ever since the errata, I would say the 2-round version was just never worth casting. But now it is, because now you can move before you let go of Inner Radiance Torrent on that second round, and that makes this a very spell slot efficient way of dealing a bunch of area damage. In my head, I still consider the 2-action version of this to be the standard way of casting this spell, but the 2-round version now actually has a niche. I can imagine a player casting it and not feeling bad about it. And that is good. It is a buff to a beloved spell that, in my opinion, got unfairly nerfed. And finally, Mirror Malefactors. Now, this spell has largely remained unchanged. If you don't know how it works, it targets a large or smaller creature, 30-foot range, basic will save, sustained up to a minute, available to anyone that is not primal. When you cast the spell, and each time you sustain it in the future, the target takes 7d8 mental damage on a basic will save. And on any outcome other than a critical success, they're surrounded by mirrors, which automatically make them frightened 1, and they're not allowed to reduce their frightened condition below that. This is true on any outcome other than a critical success. In the pre-master version, a success would also end the mirror effect. They would still take the half mental damage, but then the mirrors would shatter instantly. This spell is now pretty good. Again, it can be viewed as another variation of the whole damage plus debuff line of spells. So Vision of Death, Mist Q, and the one I covered earlier in this video whose name I have forgotten. And this is just another competent inclusion in that family of spells. Changing the success to critical success was a really good decision in my opinion. That is all the remastered and buffed spells that I could find. If I missed a buff, please let me know. I don't think I have. I looked pretty carefully, but there's so many spells in this book, I very well might have. Especially for some of the lesser known spells. Like, I have never looked at Mirror Malefactors closely before like yesterday, so there might just be many other spells I just continue to not look closely at, right? Next up, I wanted to talk about Silver Bullet spells. Silver Bullets are a pretty important part of caster gameplay. This is spells like Acid Grip to deal with enemies who like grabbing, spells that let you breathe without access to air in case you get swallowed, spells that deal with flying enemies, etc. Silver Bullets don't have to come from spellcasters, but when they come from spellcasters, they tend to have the highest reliability. So it is important to have at least a few spell-based Silver Bullets in an optimized party. And these 3 are the relevant Silver Bullets I identified in this book. There are probably many more because Silver Bullets are, by their very nature, situational, so you might think up Silver Bullet ways of using many of the other spells, including some I listed in this video. These are just the 3 highlights. First up, Begone. 1-action, touch range, divine occult spell, targets a creature, targets their fortitude, pushes them away 5, 15, or 30 feet on any outcome other than a critical success, deals a little bit of damage if their movement is stopped by a firm surface. The most obvious way to use this as a Silver Bullet is to end grappling that's being done to an ally, just like Acid Grip that I mentioned earlier. This has the marginal upside over Acid Grip in that it is a direct push away from you, which means it can always combo with dangers you might forcibly move enemies into. There's no GM ambiguity to it. And of course, it is available to Divine and Occult, which Acid Grip isn't. And Occult can make do with Gravity Well, but Gravity Well can be a little hard to aim, so having Begone in your back pocket is still nice. But where the spell's Silver Bullet utility goes up to 11 is in its traits, or rather in the lack of a specific trait. It does not have Manipulate, which means if you have been grabbed, you can use Begone to save yourself without making a flat check. If you have been restrained, it doesn't stop you from using Begone to save yourself. This is a fantastic Silver Bullet for that reason. This takes away one of the scariest parts of being in melee as a spellcaster. You would normally be pretty afraid of being grabbed or restrained, often relying on allies to help you out if you do get those conditions on you. This can save you from those conditions incredibly reliably. And of course, the other scary part of being in melee is Reactive Strike, and this might help with that. Now, Time Jump is the better Silver Bullet for Reactive Strike because it's 1 action, no Manipulate, you just stride twice without triggering reactions. Doesn't get much better than that as a Silver Bullet as far as Reactive Strike goes, but 1, the push in this might help you against Reactive Strike. The failure almost certainly will. The critical failure 100% will against anything that's not like a Froghemoth. The success might. The thing might have reach, and this might not matter, but it might also matter, especially against medium-sized foes, even in high-level play. But importantly, Divine has no access to time jump, so they might as well use this as a way to save themselves from reactive strike if necessary. And Occult can now have both this and time jump and have a solid brace of one-action silver bullets in rank 3. Next up, a very interesting second rank silver bullet, Palm Held Sun. And this is sort of like 3 silver bullets wrapped up into one. First up, you shed 30-foot emanation of bright light. Then the light counts as natural sunlight, which is a great silver bullet against something like a vampire. Now, both of these, light blindness and sunlight hypersensitivity, both of these tend to be very narrow and niche silver bullets. And that is where the third silver bullet comes in. Whenever you cast or sustain a spell, each creature that is in the bright light area of the spell takes 1 vitality damage. They also take 1 vitality damage if they take fire damage from any source. 1 vitality damage is not a lot, but look at how big a weakness to vitality damage undead creatures often have. Zombies have ginormous vitality weaknesses, and 1 automatic vitality damage is going to wear them down so quickly once you cast this spell, making this a really good silver bullet against undead, and then also a situational but even more good silver bullet against things that don't like sunlight. And finally, I just wanted to highlight this new 10th rank spell called Theogony, I don't know how to pronounce it. Again, another divine spell, sanctified, 120-foot burst centered on you, and what it does is takes your trait, holy or unholy, imparts it onto your allies, and then for all enemies in that area, it gives them the opposite of that trait. So if you're holy, they become unholy. If you're unholy, they become holy, and grants them a weakness to your sanctification type of damage. You also grant your allies sanctification on their strikes, and they deal additional 1d10 spirit damage. And they gain a fly speed equal to their highest speed. And all enemies take an additional 10 spirit damage from critical hits or critically failed saving throws. This is such a fantastic spell, and I put it in the silver bullet section mostly as a meme because it's not really a silver bullet, because typically silver bullets are about carefully lining up the spell for the situation. This spell forces the situation onto the enemies. It gives them a weakness to the damage you do. Then it takes the damage you do and gives it to all your friends, and now all of you are just ganging up on this enemy and doing a whole bunch of damage. Again, another fantastic 10th rank spell. When I first joined this game, a lot of 10th rank spells were pretty lackluster, but now we've gotten to the point where there's quite a few good 10th rank spells, and I'm really happy for that, because 10th rank spells, the ones you get once per day, are supposed to be like the showing off of how awesome and reality bending your spellcasters can be. And even setting aside 10th rank spells, these first 2 silver bullets I covered, fantastic at the situations that they do cover. Especially Begone. I feel like I'll be picking Begone on almost any caster that can pick it because it just does so much for so little. Next up, I wanted to highlight a whole bunch of new healing spells. This is because healing is generally a bit repetitive. I'm not saying you have to be casting 2-action heal or soothe every single round. If you're doing that, the problem is not the spells, the problem is a complete and utter lack of coordination from your party. And if you're happy doing that, then whatever. But if you don't want to be doing that, the problem's not the spells, the problem is the party members not contributing to defense in their own way. Healing characters should be doing things other than healing on many of their turns, like debuffing, blasting, melee stuff, whatever, depending on your exact build. But the turns where you are just doing healing, there's not much of a decision to make. It's really just, who gets my 2-action heal? Do I use a 3-action heal? And then if Soothe is your main healing spell, you don't even have that decision. These spells look to me like a concerted effort from Paizo to make even those healing turns have meaningful decision making. And I think that is awesome. The first spell I wanted to highlight is Blessing of Vigor. This is not a particularly powerful spell. Most likely it's not worth using over just a 2-action heal cast after the fact, but it is interesting. Rather than healing your ally for a bunch, it gives them fast healing. The total amount of fast healing you get is less than what you would get from a 2-action heal. This is going to total up to 9 healing over 3 rounds. A 2-action heal averages 12.5. But the advantage of this spell is that it can bring an ally up from 0 HP proactively. So you can cast this during a setup turn, and then you don't need to cast heal on a crucial turn where you might have wanted to do something else because an ally is downed. And that is the reason you would consider using this spell. If you see damage coming and don't expect to be able to cast heal reactively when that time comes. Ultimately, this is a pretty situational spell. I'm not going to say this replaces heal. It can definitely supplement heal, especially once you get into higher levels. This can become a lower rank pseudo heal you use in situations where you may not want to expend a higher rank heal in that combat. Still a nice way to vary up the gameplay. Next up, Lively Flight. And this is actually a really good new healing spell. First off, it has a 60-foot range, which is more than 2-action heal. That is really nice. It heals your ally for 6d8 HP, whereas a 2-action heal would have done 3d8 plus 8. So this is quite a bit lesser, about 10.5 lesser on average, but the advantage is that when your ally receives that healing, they can fly 30 feet as a free action along a path of their choice without triggering movements. This is a fantastic spell. The target that needs healing might need help getting out of melee as well. This is not a spell you would use to bring an ally back up from 0, because when they're prone, they cannot fly. But if they're standing and in need of healing and don't want to be in melee or want to get to a different position in melee, this spell is so good for that. Next up, I want to talk about Vital Seed. Note here that this is also an occult spell. The other two were divine only, and so was the next one. This is the only one that's also occult. Now, this spell is very complicatedly worded. Please feel free to pause and just internalize how the spell works. This is how it is intended to work. You target a creature within 120 feet. If they're willing, you automatically hit them. If they're unwilling, you will make an attack roll. The attack roll does not immediately do anything, but if it hits, everyone in a 15-foot emanation around them takes 2d12 void damage from a basic fortitude save. Remember, an emanation can exclude the initial target if needed. And remember, if the creature was willing in the first place, this attack would just automatically hit them. If the initial creature was living, they're going to be healed. If the initial creature was undead, they're going to take vitality damage instead. The healing you deliver or the damage you deal is equal to twice the highest amount of damage any of the creatures targeted by the emanation earlier took. So that's how that works. You either target an ally in the front line, deal void damage to everyone around them, and then heal that ally, which seems to be the standard use case of this spell. Assuming one of the creatures failed, the ally is receiving an average of 26 HP of healing, which is certainly a lot less than an on-rank heal spell would do, but you're dealing void damage to living enemies around them in the process. If nobody failed, the healing will be pretty small, so you certainly don't want to try and use this as a replacement for spike healing. You're using this when the healing is a nice to have and the damage is what you're going for. It's like a blast that heals. The other use case, the one where the initial target was undead, is very situational. It would come up like if you're fighting, I don't know, a lich and it's living minions or something of the sort. It might come up, but don't count on it. And then this spell's heightening is a little bit stagnant, so ultimately it will fall off. It's certainly a very interesting spell though. And notably, the Vital Seed effect sort of lets you get that like 3-action heal gameplay, but with living allies and living enemies. Normally you only get to do the like damage all enemies, heal all friends gameplay with 3-action heal if your allies are living and the enemies are undead, or vice versa for 3-action harm. Vital Seed lets you extend that into a more general use case, though of course you have to be wary of friendly fire here, because it doesn't only target enemies, it does target all creatures other than the one at the center, because emanations can exclude the creature at the center if needed. And finally, a very similar spell to Vital Seed, Heartbolt. Again, there is an initial target who can be willing or unwilling. A willing living creature would take 3d10 plus 15 of healing. If they were unwilling, they would make a basic fortitude save against that much vitality damage. Regardless of what the initial thing was, whether it was vitality healing or vitality damage, what happens after is a 20-foot emanation from that original target. It heals all living creatures for 15 HP and deals 15 vitality damage to all undead creatures with a basic fortitude saving throw. And again, emanations, you can choose to include the initial target if that's beneficial. So if you're healing an ally, they will receive another 15 HP, which again is behind what a 6th rank 2-action heal would do. But then everyone around them is getting healed for 15 HP or taking 15 vitality damage. And notably, if the initial thing was against an undead enemy who critically succeeded on their save, the emanation still happens. The emanation is not stopped by them critically succeeding. This is a powerful spell, and much like Vital Seed, it seems to replicate the 3-action heal gameplay at range, and this time in the same use case as 3-action heal, rather than being in a different use case. So between these spells, I think healing just got a lot more interesting. And it does seem to be about making healing more interesting, because I did not see flips of these spells for void options. They're primarily focused on healing the living, which makes sense because most Pathfinder parties have living PCs, not undead ones. So it seems like Paizo was trying to make healing more interesting and more decision heavy to do, and they did it. These spells are fantastic. I think I might actually play a healing focused cleric sometime in the future. Next up, I wanted to talk about a whole class of spells that got expanded. Spells that let you do a funny thing with your minion, often familiars, sometimes Eidolons or companions. This is not an exhaustive list, I'm just highlighting 5 spells that stood out to me, but there were quite a few more. One standout that exists in the current version of Pathfinder before Impossible Magic comes out is Thundering Dominance, a pretty good spell to have on your familiar. And these spells are all in comparable ballparks, not all as good, but certainly all worth looking at and thinking about at least. And remember, any spell that works on a familiar is automatically at least a consideration for the witch, because the witch is the one class whose familiar is required to be on the battlefield. If your familiar is already going to be on the battlefield, it's worth considering spells that make its impact on the battlefield bigger. The witch also gets back its familiar every single day, so if your familiar gets some heat because of what they did, it's fine. You just get it back and they might be a little mad at you, but none the worse for the wear. First up, Overload Connection, a 2-action arcane and occult spell targeting your familiar, and what it does is when you cast the spell and each time you sustain it, each creature in a straight line between you and your familiar takes 3d8 mental damage. This is effectively a continuous damage blasting spell. And remember, the familiar can just have the independent, flyer, and fast flyer abilities to pretty reliably get to where they wish to be without you needing to spend an action commanding them. And of course, if you are a witch, rather than using independent, you might use Patron's Puppet or something of the sort. The damage on the spell is actually pretty nice. It's about the same as Floating Flame, but in an area that's generally more flexible because your familiar, especially if it has independent, is going to be moving around the battlefield, presumably doing other things that justify it being on the battlefield as well, and it affects everyone in that straight line between you and the familiar. Rather than Floating Flame, which usually only affects 1 to 2 targets at a time, this might genuinely affect more than that. There doesn't even seem to be a restriction on how far the familiar can be from you when this line is being extended. So, like, you can cover a pretty large amount of space in certain circumstances. A pretty decent spell, in my opinion. Blasting Witches might like it, though a Blasting Witch is probably primal, so they may not have access to this, but maybe Seneschal Arcane Witches might really like this because that is a good way to blast as a witch. Then there is Companion's Shadow. This targets animal companions and is available to any non-arcane caster, and it's a pretty simple effect. The first time your companion makes a strike, they make a mapless strike against a different creature within range, the flavor being that their shadow is making that second strike. It deals void damage rather than the normal damage of the strike, and then the multiple attack penalty increases for 2 strikes after. This seems like a decent spell. Honestly, the most interesting use case for this might be the Flurry Ranger, which means a Flurry Ranger with Druid archetype or something along those lines would definitely be something to consider for the spell. But it's also good on like a Druid with an animal companion if you get some setup time. I probably wouldn't use this as like my go-to turn 1 spell, but it's certainly a decent pre-buff and maybe in some circumstances good on an early turn, especially if you are an animal order Druid who is heavily investing in that animal companion. Then there is Burning Trail. This targets either your animal companion or your Eidolon. For the next minute, the first time the target strides, they leave a mini wall of fire. It works the same way. The damage has the same timing, and creatures on opposite sides are concealed from one another. The differences are that this is going to deal less damage than a wall of fire, but the area is more flexible. Each square that your companion went through during their stride becomes part of this wall of fire effect. And that's pretty nice, because Wall of Fire is a nice spell to start out a combat with, especially if you're dividing your room, but once enemies have moved out of it, you have to sort of contrive situations for it to be good again. You have to shove creatures back into it for the auto damage. Because this area bends around enemies as your companion or Eidolon took the stride action, you can much more easily enable this. And then that companion or Eidolon can either grapple or shove enemies to really get some value out of this. This is honestly a good opening turn. You spend 2 actions casting this, command your companion to leave a convenient area of fire, and then grapple an enemy who might take repetitive damage from it, or immediately shove somebody, and then you will double dip on the one you just shoved. And of course, allies can get in on this action too. And everything I just said about the companion, apply the same logic to the Eidolon with the act together action, and the same sort of efficiency applies. So I think this is a pretty good 3rd rank effect. Next up, a really funny 4th rank spell. Sudden Swarm. What you do is you take your familiar and make it divide into several copies of itself until it occupies a large space and has swarm rules. So it has weakness to area and splash damage, it has resistance to piercing and slashing damage, occupies the space of a large creature, and can share the same space as other creatures. Also, if it gets reduced to 0 HP while the spell is on, it is instead reduced to 1 HP, so that is nice too. Once per turn, your familiar is allowed to use the Swarming Bites action, which is just yet another mini floating flame-like effect. Paizo designers really wanted to fill this book up with continuous damage effect, so 3d6 damage on a basic reflex save. For context, a floating flame heightened to this rank would do 5d6, but again would be much less flexible, because when this effect moves around, it's using your familiar's movement speed. When you cast a spell, you immediately command your familiar, so it can immediately stride up to an enemy and use Swarming Bites. And then the first time each round you sustain the spell, you again command your familiar as part of the same action. Swarming Bites is only once per turn, so you definitely want the familiar to be doing something else useful with its other action, which of course might just be movement, but you might have other things to do with that second action for the familiar. Honestly, a pretty decent damaging spell. I wish the damage was a little bit higher. Like the damaging spell in the previous slide, the one that made the line, the damage was genuinely higher than this. It would be doing 4d8 damage at this rank, whereas this is doing 3d6. Of course, this spell has the flexibility of allowing you to command the familiar as part of sustaining it, but even so, I do wish it was a little bit better in damage. That being said, Still a decent spell, still a really funny spell. I want to try and build a witch that will cast it one day, and this is available to Primal. The other one wasn't. And then there is Patron's Protector, another funny familiar spell. This one turns your familiar into a tank. And I do use the word tank here pretty loosely because their AC is not high for their level. They do gain 20 temp HP, and they do get the if they get reduced to 0 HP, they've dropped a 1 HP and the spell ends effect. And it follows similar templating as the previous spell. When you cast or sustain the spell, you command the familiar. The familiar has a once per turn action that can take two forms. Either it deals a little bit of damage and pushes a target, or it shoves a willing ally out of danger and boosts their AC. That's why I call this a tanking spell, because like the utility of this is tanking, and seeing this crow or rat or whatever grow to a big size and start shoving people around is going to draw fire. I think this is genuinely a decent spell. The problem here is the heightening is not smooth at all. At 9th rank, it gains an 8-point jump in AC, a meaningful damage increase, and a bunch more temp HP, but this should have been smoothed out as a heightened +1 rather than being a single shot heightened like that. So aside from that, this is still a good spell. Ultimately, of all the categories of spells I have shown so far, this is probably the most mixed bag of them all, because these are all like haha funny familiar companion Eidolon effects where you're often jumping through hoops to do something that a well-built spellcaster could do something similar to anyways. But come on, these are so fun, I had to highlight these. Use them if you want. If you think they're bad, I guess skip over them, but they're definitely fun considerations. And finally, I wanted to end on a high and epic note, so let's talk about two standout incarnate spells. Note, these are not the only two new incarnate spells in the book. There's a couple more, I think. You'll see once the book is fully released. But these are the two that stood out to me. Now, incarnate spells tend to be some of the harder to evaluate ones. The way it works is this. You get one upfront effect right away when you cast the spell. It's called the Arrive. And then you get a Depart effect at the end of your next turn. Between the Arrive and the Depart, the Incarnate can move, so it's pretty hard for enemies to avoid the effect in any meaningful capacity, because most Incarnate spells, other than like the really lower rank ones, have very high and flexible movement speeds. A lot of Incarnate effects also exclude allies, or have flexible enough movement and AoE templates that you can position them to exclude allies. So they actually tend to be really ally friendly. And sometimes they're easy to evaluate. So for example, Incarnate Draconic Legion. Very simple effect to evaluate. It does a bunch of damage up front, and it does a bunch of damage at the end of your second turn. You should use it if ally friendliness is a factor, and or you don't expect that your first two turns were gonna outdamage this spell anyways with some other high value first turn spell. In particular, if on the first turn you think you could have done enough damage to cause somebody to drop by turn 2, and Incarnate Draconic Legion is preventing that from happening, you probably wouldn't use Draconic Legion. If you think this combat is going to be long and drawn out, use Incarnate Draconic Legion. Pretty easy to evaluate. Once you move past straight up damage, it gets a little bit harder to judge them. The way I like to judge them is this. Is the spell going to generate enough of a tempo advantage up front to then make it worth waiting till the end of your second turn for the rest of the spell's value? And the most obvious way for a spell to do this is to slow down the enemies up front. Slowing down the enemy's tempo means not spending too hefty a cost for drawing out this combat, because the enemies are not active for as long as they could have been in that longer combat. And generally speaking, that is a good template to evaluate incarnate spells by. If the arrival effect is able to deny the enemy side a meaningful number of actions, or even take some of them out of combat entirely, then the incarnate spell is worth it, especially if it also has a good depart effect that you would want on a spell anyways. You can kind of view a rough heuristic of, will the incarnate's arrive effect feel like half a turn of delay in combat to then justify the delay in the rest of its effect coming. And both of the spells I show you do hit this criteria. First up, Incarnate Skeletal Giant, a 5th rank spell on the Divine and notably Occult spell lists. They really made sure to let Occult get the necrotic and undead theme going for it. This is a huge creature that can move 40 feet before it departs, and when it arrives, it makes a huge emanation for all enemies, who then get knocked prone on a success, prone and clumsy 1 on a failure, prone and clumsy 2 on a critical failure. This is very nice. Prone is action denial up front. Enemies are probably going to spend actions standing up or spend their time debuffed. And failure and critical failure, debuffing enemies' AC and reflex saves, means that your allies are going to have an easier time bringing them down. So this both slows down enemy tempo slightly and speeds up your side's tempo slightly to justify waiting for the rest of the effect. And the rest of the effect is pretty simple. 2 different targets within 30 feet take 6d6 bludgeoning damage on a basic reflex save. So the departing effect is just a delayed ally-friendly blast. This is a good incarnate spell. You can use it while the party is on its opening salvos, and once they're close into melee, you can contribute damage wherever it's needed. It's really flexible and ally-friendly. And in that opening salvo, you are slowing down the enemy's tempo and or debuffing them. Pretty solid spell in my opinion. And next up, Incarnate Ancient Spectre. This is a spectacular spell for rank 7. It occupies space of a medium creature, and when it arrives, only enemies in a 60-foot emanation attempt a will save. On a success, they are proned as a free action, similar to Incarnate Skeletal Giant, but the difference is, on a failure, they are also unable to stand for the duration of the spell. And on a critical failure, they get that and become dazzled for the duration of the spell. This is actually a devastating controlling effect if you are high up in initiative. Enemies are arriving, use Incarnate Ancient Spectre. Anyone who failed cannot close the gap with your party. They're stuck where they are for a round until their following turn. And even the ones who succeeded will probably lose an action if they're trying to close the gap with your party. This spell, to me, screams either your party is using it as a divide and conquer strategy, like say ganging up on the people who succeeded or critically succeeded while letting the ones who failed or critically failed just stay where they are, or your party is using this as a way to stay at range for a little longer, setting up their other options, putting up buffs, looking at consumables, and or just poking away from range. And the depart effect of this spell is nothing spectacular. It is 4d6 of persistent damage, very ally-friendly. It only affects enemies, and they become dazzled for as long as they take the persistent bleed damage if they fail the save. That is a decent chunk of poke damage, nothing amazing, but this is a spell I really like for its arrive effect. The amount of control it inflicts up front is devastating. And honestly, maybe I'm overrating these spells. I have personally always loved Incarnate Spells. Conquering Soldiers is my favorite 10th rank spell. Incarnate Elemental Herald is my favorite other incarnate spell than Conquering Soldiers. I have always had a soft spot for incarnates, but both of these are, in my opinion, pretty good and worth considering. And of course, this book did reprint a lot of the existing good incarnate spells, like Incarnate Kaiju got reprinted, and that's always been a pretty good spell to have. And that is it for this video, folks. This was a long one. The longest video on my channel ever? Question mark? And obviously it took some of the highest prep I have ever done for any video on this channel because I went through every spell in the book. And it's very likely I missed some stuff. I know there was another Redditor who made like this 10,000 word essay on every single spell, and they probably hit a whole bunch of things that I didn't. If I missed something, please let me know in the comments. This was meant to be more of a highlights reel anyways, not an exhaustive list, and I think this video does a good job showcasing how awesome the spells are. If you wholeheartedly agree or vehemently disagree with any of my evaluations, please let me know. I'm happy to discuss. This video is just probably going to garner a lot of discussion. Honestly, Impossible Magic has been So great for spellcasters. And if you want to see some of the awesome art in the book, if you just want a copy of book on your hands, or if you want to support Paizo, I recommend buying it from them, and the link to their store is in the video description below. This book, I think, is going to have such a huge impact on how spellcasters are built and played in this game. In particular, I think they did a really good job fleshing out themes that needed fleshing. Before Impossible Magic, it was pretty hard to build a cold-themed spellcaster, a metal-themed spellcaster, a gravity-themed spellcaster, and all of these got so much fleshing out. Honestly, whatever designers were in charge of going through spells with a fine-toothed comb, seeing what needed changes, what needed upgrades, what themes needed new stuff brought to light, hats off to you. You have done a fantastic job on anything that wasn't a battle form spell. Sorry, I had to throw shade one time for that again. Sorry, I really had to throw shade one more time for that. But aside from that, the spells are spectacular. You've knocked it out of the park. Most of the spells I see in this book are good and worth using, and any of you, when you get your hands on the book or when the rules are out on Nethys, make sure to do a deep dive of your own. You're probably going to see so much stuff that I missed. If you enjoyed this content, please like and comment. Every little bit of engagement helps. If you'd like to see my future videos, including any other videos I might make on the Impossible Magic series, make sure to subscribe and click the channel notifications button. And if you'd like to directly support me, please consider joining a channel membership. It is a small fee that directly helps this channel grow and run, and of course, you get a few small perks from it, which I have unfortunately not been doing my due diligence on, so right now, the perk is just early video access and 2 incomplete guides, but I will try and flesh them out as soon as I'm less busy. Regardless, I hope I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.